But yeah, delighted to be joining you today. Very grateful for the invitation, and especially looking at the kind of characters this group usually invites. So you've got the legendary Tom Guild coming along. It's extraordinary to be mentioned in the same paragraph as the legend. So yeah, a proud fellow of the BCS, senior advisor at Superbet, long-time CTO. The second half of my career working in a range of corporate settings in sectors such as gaming, telecommunications, marketing, professional services, with such as BT, William Hill and Labara, among others. And for the first half of my career, I worked purely within the technology sector. So started out in informatics, information science. I was a member of the founding team at Answer Digital. And then right at the start of my career, lucky to get a couple of years with Netscape as we rolled out the first version of the commercial web in the late 1990s. So, setting the scene for this whole swirl that surrounds us now. And the debates around the evolution of the IT profession often specifically contrast the different worlds of so-called tech and so-called corporate, and pitting the two against each other. So having spent over a decade in each separately, I hope I can bring a useful perspective to this discussion. And I am very much looking forward to the discussion. So this is me offering up a discussion topic, and by no means offering direction. I'm keen to learn from this audience today. So what is with this title? Well, the Red Queen hypothesis was coined in the field of evolutionary biology by a chap called Lee Van Valen to explain that a species must adapt and evolve not just for its reproductive advantage, but also for survival, because competing organisms are also evolving. So guess what? Adaptability is quite important to the notion of keeping up. And that idea worm was planted in my mind by Simon Wardley, for those of you familiar with his work, and there's more of him later in this talk. So I'm going to set the stage first with an evaluation of what has changed so far. I think that gives us a useful kind of benchmarking point. What are the changes we've already been through, and what the scale and pace of change looks like, and how, in some contexts, in some organizations, the typical response prevents progress. And then before looking at what we can do about that, and even getting ahead of these changes. So there are at least 30 versions of this I could have chosen, different reference points, different scale. The point is that both the ambition and the pace of tech is exponentially increasing. And artificial is on the current horizon line expectation. That would have been unimaginable to those of us that began our careers, for instance, in the 1990s. And then it was the stuff of pure science fiction. And I think this kind of reflects, the original challenge. When Dalim got in touch with me, he picked up my enthusiasm for technology, and he appropriately threw the challenge, well, how are we supposed to keep up with all of this? So I think this is a good reference point from the World Economic Forum of these successive waves of change, the increasing in frequency, but also in scope and scale of what we can do. And how things have changed since then. So when I started my IT career, this was typically the kind of kit on your desk. And what's not useful about this is it doesn't show the relative scale. So, those boxes were typically 2 or 3 feet tall. The monitor, unfortunately, doesn't show the depth. You needed a good 4 feet clearance behind the desk for your monitor then. So it's big old stuff. I'm not sure this does it justice, but it made me feel good reflecting on those good times. And this is what the web looked like. Can you imagine that the web was small enough you could actually contain it in a directory, and you could provide a guided tour. There may be some others on the call who may be old enough to remember WASE, like myself. You actually could have the web as a menu. And what about the world outside of tech? What did that look like? Well, these were the companies topping the charts then for commercial success as the web surge first began. And it's interesting to see the mix of energy, telco, beverages, consumer goods, retail, pharmaceutical, even tobacco in there, and tech's there. Look, IBM And whatever happened to them, I wonder. And we fast forward to today, and how things have changed. So we've lost all sector diversity in this league table now, where tech completely dominates. And this was just a random snapshot from last week, but it's interesting to note that 9 of the top 10 now are technology companies, and 8 of those are arguably software companies. So yeah, there always is an argument around some of this. So some people might query Tesla, for instance. Well, it's interesting that, Elon Musk himself declared it in the investor call in October that Tesla should really be thought of as roughly a dozen technology startups, many of which have little or no correlation with traditional automotive companies. And there's always something of a debate about Apple, but I think it is fairly recently, I'm sure I saw that they now have more software engineers than hardware engineers, and they're targeting things like 92 billion of revenue just through the App Store alone this year. So clearly, software is eating the world, and of course, this was foreseen a decade ago now by Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz, the famous venture firm behind so many of the great tech success stories, and of course the man behind the first commercial browser at Netscape. So he drew reference to the then new companies that were seemingly growing at unstoppable momentum and drawing a clear path from the future to the present that becomes truer every day, with tech now enveloping every aspect of our lives. And of course, we may now reflect that some of them have absolutely gone too far. But there is no denying that the impact of these entities have had on the world of technology, and absolutely the world of IT. So what of enterprise IT? What journey have we been on? Well, in the 1990s, when you were considering your technology planning and you were seeking guidance for the direction you should take, so what were the technology options, you were pretty much obligated to present yourself at the altars of these mighty cathedrals, if you like. Many of these are now gone. Those that still exist are a shell of their former selves, but arguably only Microsoft remains in the major leagues, or still in that top 10 of global industry. And having pulled off one of the most spectacular reinventions ever seen. So as an advisor, I'm often asked, what does digital transformation look like? And if you read up on the Microsoft story, and you'll see they've substituted huge swathes of their core proposition for completely alternative offerings, made several existential bets, so putting the core proposition at risk. And all of that, of course, has paid off handsomely in retrospect. But that's absolutely what digital transformation looks like. It fundamentally is not that 10 or 15% uplift on the IT budget. And that substitution theme is one that we will return to in other contexts in this talk. Moving forward a few years to 2002, and here's the Amazon homepage from the time. The bookseller had branched out a little by now, but still none of us back then would have believed that in less than 5 years, these guys would launch one of the biggest innovations in enterprise IT for decades. That this bookshop would leapfrog IBM, Microsoft, Oracle to the forefront of the enterprise IT consideration. And here we are. And of course, that was only a single stream out of a tsunami of tech innovation, flowing as the exhaust fumes, if you like, from the leaders of the consumer internet. So from the Google file system and MapReduce papers that were published that inspired the first generation of big data and the form of the first build of Hadoop put together by the Yahoo team, to waves and waves of change that are hitting us still from these names and many more, we truly have traveled from the cathedral to the bazaar. So not as a truly open source, but certainly as a more diverse community presence than before. So how you keep up now is no longer through the enterprise IT vendor marketplace, but by tapping into these communities. And yes, if you look more than a moment at that word cloud, many of these themes are repeating. And that is a hint, somewhat cheesily given, to one of the core messages for this piece. So clearly, enterprise IT is on the move. Well, things were on the move, but they just got a tremendous shove. So a year ago to this day, few of us were planning to mobilize within 3 weeks. switching entire operations online in what turned out to be, less than that 3-week period. So, lockdown 23rd of March. If you don't already have it planned, please take that day out as a day of recognition for your team. It's an extraordinary response. And there's a lot in that for this notion of how do we pick up the new? It's sobering how much the world of enterprise IT has changed in this period. So many digital initiatives, languishing on so many declined budget lists for so long, suddenly rushed through. And with the dramatic rise in e-commerce, many organizations have been forced to reprioritize their digital efforts. For most organizations, the rapid response has been remarkable, and a testament to the strength of community and resilience that underpins our species, but we absolutely needed a reminder was there. And it seems this was no blip. So interesting to note that we saw the equivalent of 10 years worth of e-commerce growth in less than 3 months. And meanwhile, interesting to see the statistics from computing.co.uk this week. Nearly 1.6 million people had roles in Britain's IT sector in Q4 2020, up from 1.5 million in Q2. And the IT industry has created more than 100,000 jobs since the start of last year, and more than 300,000 jobs over the last 3 years, according to the Office of National Statistics. So by now, some of you will be thinking, okay, we've got the message. It's all about tech. You've got tech, tech, tech. Okay, we get that. Well, that in itself needs tempering. So the business graveyard is absolutely full of the corpses of those that could claim to be excellent technology companies, but still ultimately failed. And you've no idea how painful it is for me personally to include the Netscape logo in this mix. The bottom right-hand corner leaping dog is probably not that recognizable to most of you. It represents a product called Chandler, not famous at all, but a good excuse for me to plug my favorite book, Dreaming in Code by Scott Rosenberg. You can see the link to it there. It's a wonderful testament for anyone that's ever had to make an IT project commitment. And it proves even having the best tech talent in the room doesn't necessarily make the difference. You can read The Mythical Man Month, you can read lots of great worthy tomes out there about the underpinnings of that kind of operating, but the great thing about this book is it tells it all through a true compelling life story. It's a diary and it is absolutely fabulous. So clearly it's what you do with tech that makes the difference. So where do we find that out? Well, we could ask the analysts and get the same priceless guidance that others have received. So for instance, in 2006, that Apple should exit the hardware business. And to be clear, that was just the year before they released the iPhone. So the rest is history. Or the same analysis that just declared in January this year, the statement, by 2025, the cloud will be the key driver of business innovation. Okay, so nearly 20 years after it happened. Well, at the risk of sounding impatient, I'd like to understand what everybody's been doing until now. 14 years after, never mind waiting until 2025 before leveraging that. Or we could chew through the welter of materials that tells us as IT leaders that your job is to align with the business. And I absolutely don't get this industrialization of the IT inferiority complex. It's almost like an industry-wide imposter syndrome. So why aren't we telling CFOs to demonstrate the business value of finance? Think about that global commerce league. Do we really still need to question whether technology is a first-order concern for relative competitive stature for any organization in any vertical now? So I think we're finding that the truth is you can't outsource strategy. So if we're interested in keeping ahead, we need to understand what we need to keep ahead in and why. And it's a foible of many in the IT community to first solicit a steer from this thing we call a business strategy, that being something that the business is responsible for. And we usually distinguish it as in, it's not us, we exclude ourselves from the conversation. So this is the business, we need the business strategy, and then on the back of the business strategy, we can define the IT strategy. And that separation for me is a problematic pattern that I will return to later in this theme. But even assuming that there are statements declaring business direction through digital. They tend to look like this. So these are not strategies. These are statements of what we will do, what we plan to do. There's nothing really on why, nothing on our advantage, or where we will focus our efforts. So what gives us leverage in this particular strategy option? And for me, the acid test in any of these definitions is, would you dare share this with your competitor? So for so many of these statements, the competitor's response is always going to be a simple shrug of the shoulders. Every business, every day needs to grow sales, be more efficient, recruit the best talent. These are not your secret sauce. And the usual IT playback, unfortunately, is rarely any better. It usually ends up as a shopping list for technology, a plea to yet again increase the IT budget. So fulfilling our role as the cost center, the business makes the cash, IT spends the cash. And these are also all very inward looking. Where's the joy we will provide to our customers in any of this? So the subsequent prescriptions for how we'll take things forward from the IT strategy directions are even worse, with the genuine rationale for some of this being little more than, this is what Google do, so obviously it's what we should be doing. And for instance, knee-jerking to grab every new trend as it comes. I don't even put a name in here since they'll come and go so quickly, but I'm sure you've got your favorite flavor of the month tool that everybody's talking about that was different from 6 months ago, different from 4 years ago. So, leaping to follow the current, just because it is the current thing, or it's perceived to be attached to the digital leaders. Well, not so fast. So, he is one of the digital masters, usually preeminent in all examples, taking 12 years to recover some technical debt. So clearly its strategy had other matters in mind meanwhile. And since we're looking at the ultimate, digital operator in Amazon, this is interesting. It turns out that, that 12 years to replace the Oracle database with their equivalent was subject to prioritization. And in this instance, they were focused instead in turning one of their biggest cost centers into an actual profit center through the period. So a great strategy move. And here we've got a great example from just this week. So this was published on Monday. You often hear many organizations complain that they can't pick up the new stuff because they've got too much tech debt. And there's a mutual blame storm then between the business and the IT team as to whose fault this is. I've known several examples where major initiatives were canned simply because a significant rewrite was needed. And you'll hear statements like, well, it's okay for the new tech companies, they're working on a blank sheet of paper. We can't work in that ideal world. And unfortunately, I've seen some IT leaders attempt to hide the scale of the tech recovery work needed, seeing it almost as a point of shame that they dare not confess to. Here we see a very different attitude. Netflix proudly broadcasting their commitment. 3-year transition for some new approaches for them that requires a very significant rewrite. And you read these phrases, I've heard these phrases every day in some 50, 60, 100-year-old organizations. Here's one of the tech giants going through exactly the same pain, but interestingly, broadcasting the virtue of it and broadcasting the benefit of that to their business. So we'll be highlighting later that you do need appropriate technology leadership to contain technical debt as far as possible, but it should also be recognized that competing priorities will often win out, and you must return to pick that up again someday down the line. So you can't always leap for the next new thing. This one is especially pernicious. If we were in an open hall now, I'd be asking for a show of hands, and I'd be pretty sure I'd get something like a full house. Anyone who's pursued this route has found out the hard way that matrix management is really hard. And Spotify actually haven't nailed it. So you should be wary of taking those pleasing diagrams as templates, which I've seen far too many organizations do. And what they did do, and what they continue to do as the genuine source of their genuine competitive strength, is they empowered their teams to work it through. So check out the links listed here and the subsequent links from that piece for the true representation of what actually a continuously learning, continuously improving organization looks like, which is the actuality of how they keep ahead, not by those beguilingly specific prescriptive structures that are illustrated. So forget the templates. Don't lift and shift another organization's context onto your own. Be inspired by their approach, for instance, in that, empowering the teams, but work it out for yourselves according to your context. And then this last example is a good example of what I've seen in a lot of organizations. The DevOps movement has caused an awful lot of change in a lot of organizations, especially in IT operations team. Infrastructure is code now, so what does that mean to how we work? Many have literally relabeled IT ops as site reliability engineering. They've drawn down the relevant cloud certifications and dusted off their hands with job done. Again, taking the Google model as a template. Well, guess what? That ain't necessarily true either. So John, listed here, was a Google site reliability engineer, now at AWS, which is ironic since many of you will also be familiar. There is the oft-quoted Amazon rule for you build it, you run it. They're completely contrary to the notion of having separate support coverage. And of course, that's true as well, except of course where they hire support site reliability engineers like Jana. Check out the Amazon careers site. You'll see literally hundreds of those roles on there. So the point being, which I appreciate I've maybe somewhat belabored, but I see them everywhere, these examples. The point being that there are contradictions in all these seeming recipes. None of these were ever intended as recipes, because the reality of life in any organization of any scale is that multiple patterns apply, usually at once. Product teams are optimal and supporting platforms are often necessary. Where you have exploratory work to be done, you'll find pure agile is a very good approach, and in lots of other contexts you'll find it really isn't. So now we're into the enactment and the execution of our intended strategy that we hope will help us validate our direction. We've done our business SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats analysis. We've got our requirements underway, we've drafted our architecture, and we've agreed the portfolio of work. Some way in, 18 months, a year, or even as little as a quarter, things are looking tough. The portfolio is turning red and the original strategy is somewhat dimmed. What was that thing all about again? We've no idea. We started, but we're going to finish this thing. We're going to get it over the line. So finish the project at all costs. So we reviewed the requirements. Did you notice that meant they got smaller? Couldn't help that gag. That did the job. The plan's no longer red, although it's now materially bigger, and the strategy is dimmer still than previous. A lot's changed since we began this thing, and we're confident that to pull this around, there are some new frameworks and tools we'd like to introduce into the architecture. We diligently run these options through with the business, and we're pointing to them on that lovely architecture diagram there. Look, it's these options. We want to change these. We think we could insource point A and outsource point B, and we'll run a cost-benefit analysis on that. And we found this great framework, and this framework is really going to be interesting. And we need to use this framework because all the tech leaders are using it. We get nowhere in that conversation, and I'm sure we've all been there in how we pull around this whole scenario. So how do we pull this around and give all the stakeholders the ability to contribute together? A world away where we're having to mediate between what's happening under the tech and what do we think is a business strategy. Well, let's start with the architecture. See if we can make it something legible. Assume that we're in discussion with the CEO, for instance. Well, we have an understanding of our essential components. So who are we envisaging the most basic elements of a usual corporate offering to its online market? The magic system, by the way, is my labeling, just representing an unfeasible number of verticals, which I appreciate I can't do specifically. But those of you may be wondering, it's that highly precious business processing platform that you find in most settings, and I'm sure you've all got examples of this. It's usually a third-party offering, It usually predates cloud, and it's usually a tricky bundle of local customizations that third-party vendor fights a losing battle to prevent skewing with a central build. And the more specific the niche or the vertical, the more arcane these things are. They tend to have grown up over a number of years. But certainly every corporate I've worked with spends much of its IT budget working at the edges of these things, trying to customize them, and the sunk cost dependency drag is often monumental. And these kinds of vendors have all typically started to use terms such as cloud, cloud-based SaaS, which all sounds good until you mean that what they mean is they will host it for you, but otherwise they'll make no improvements in provisioning, availability on demand, pricing on demand, or API access, straightforward traditional licensing models. So actually missing all of the benefits of the actual cloud, but nonetheless. And we isolate these pieces now as our understanding of this particular business's value chain and how that can be described. So all well and good, and I'm sure there's many of you at this point probably finding this somewhat underwhelming. And it's the frame of reference that we give this view that makes a difference in our subsequent evaluation. So this framing is useful in many ways, but not least in that it forces us to confront a world where everything is changing all the time. So created by the wonderful Simon Wardley, I urge any of you that have not fully explored Wardley mapping yet to do so. The labels at the bottom broadly define the relative scale of all market offerings during their life cycle. And the labels on the side help us broadly benchmark where components may best sit. And I appreciate many of you may not have seen this before, so I'm just letting the framing sink in before we bring our value chain back into consideration. But for me, this, what I also find helpful in this, it does genuinely suggest time passing. All things pass through these phases, left to right. And in fact, as some tech progresses along this path, you can practically hear the whooshing sound in your ears. So, smartphones, for instance, barely 10 years to pass through. So we start off with the customer's need. And it's all about, the framing and the reference and the focus starting with that. So our particular trite example, which I appreciate is trite, but please do bear with me for the sake of understanding the model. Our customer wants magic on tap. And what does our value chain look like to deliver that? Well, when we place the components of our value chain on here with the right people in the room, several things become apparent. For instance, you'll often find that instead of these neat instances that I've illustrated here, we actually have 10 versions of, for instance, the database. So we can pursue the tech redundancy conversation and save those costs. This also gives us an opportunity to assess where we sit versus the marketplace, versus the industry. And the most common pattern in just about every team I've worked with is that they're busy maintaining stuff in the product or even custom segment that's actually available as a commodity, especially through cloud. So again, this triggers a great set of conversations. How much are we attempting? How much are we spending to attempt to fight the tide of time? And have we even confronted this reality? And maybe it's time to recognize that those elements consuming significant chunks of our team and investment today, we should actually let go of. Why are we building our own environments? By taking those off our roster, we give all the focus to our magic system now. So we've now moved everything to that commodity. We've maybe taken advantage of cloud environments rather than building these things for ourselves, or platform as a service, for instance. And we can start to envisage now, what does this focus afford us? But even in that moving, even in that positioning, that's a kind of a conversation that could be supported by, people who've got no appreciation of IT whatsoever being in the room, able to join in the conversation now in real time with the IT team members, and the IT team members getting involved in spotting opportunities. So it's like starting to swap those seats, if you like. And of course, this could be seen as almost as a fractal. So now we've put the focus on our magic system. We've suggested our move to make our development more cost effective by taking advantage of those commodity elements. But what about if we look under the hood of our magic system? And the beauty of this approach is any node and any map can become the subject of its own map. So for the sake of discussion, we'll have a look at that. And when we zoom in, almost like a fractal, if you like, we find that under the hood of our magic system, there's also some interesting elements. And this is a very often, very commonly repeated pattern. So they've got a custom built content management system. Why? Why in 2021 are we running with a custom built content management system? And then they've got a workflow engine, and that's running on, happens to be running on an enterprise service bus, but that's customized somewhat, and that's out there in the product space. And look where they've got their database and server environments. These are all a lag on our performance. These are all a lag on our investment, certainly a lag on our ability to move. So how about we consider that's maybe a move the tech team itself would suggest to make. And we suggest that we look at commoditizing that. And there's a pattern that starts to emerge when we explore these moves. If we commoditize that, that means we can think about something that's genuinely worth investing in the custom built space that's not been done yet. So how can we provide the service we provide today, but in a much easier, much smarter way than we provide it today? And instead of spending our money on the things which actually, if we realize it, have actually become commodities, we spend our money on the things that will be a genuine differentiator. And maybe these are the things that pull in the leading edge capabilities, because that's how we realize them. So we make it smarter through artificial intelligence, for instance. And there's your market for the leading edge. So we've got, this point is this whole playthrough, which I appreciate maybe have been a little labored for those of you who are familiar with the approach. But I do meet time and again teams who do not have this level of situational awareness. It's the benefit of the dialogue in working that through. And this specific example as well is not that helpful, in that I actually find the greatest benefit for this to be when we're running it on a whiteboard with everybody in a room. And for me, ideally, the thing would not be preserved, at all, other than to share with teams externally. But there's a level of, it's about that riffing, it's about that dialogue, it's about that participation, and everybody can play a part in deciding these options. And maybe it's the IT team that spots an extreme competitive move that the organization can make that puts us much more on the front foot. One reason, I certainly see in some organizations the inability to keep up is because the change is happening to them rather than them leading the change. Our competitors going to cloud, we better too, or the command issued from the boardroom. Well, this mechanism gives you the capability to anticipate. So as well as the framework, Simon's also collected the observations from millions of players through this approach that give you these scenarios to exploit. And glaringly obvious, that first one, as I say, is abundant in an awful lot of teams. Not being situationally aware that the fact that things are evolving literally under your feet, and there is no choice in this. So, when we start to explore some of those moves, what about if we commoditize this piece and build a new thing on top? Somebody will often volunteer, well, we can't commoditize that because, well, that's our business. Well, in exploring the option, you were pointing out the inevitability that at some point somebody is going to do that. And it's incredible the number of organizations that try and attempt to create an artificial moat, if you like, so by them not commoditizing it, nobody else will think of doing it. When it's as the sequence shows, it's entirely inevitable. So why not be the masters of your own destiny and explore those options that are the new thing on the left, that custom engineered element that opens new opportunities for the organization. And then the last two are particularly powerful. We're globally sketching potential positions here, but making that move is another thing entirely. So the past success breeds inertia is the core reason we've seen so many organizations fail when the digital moves are made. So, and why you'll see organizations hiring lots of great tech and a pursuit of we want to be like those digital greats, and it's because they weren't able to exploit the business model move that meant they weren't actually successful. And as we saw earlier, tech by itself is not enough. When you find the thing that means it's hard for your competitors to compete. So for instance, the AWS licensing model made it really difficult for all of those vendors using traditional licensing models to switch overnight. Then that's when you're into something, genuinely more competitive. If it's plot that scenario. If it's a threat to you, it's potentially the key to a business model shift that prevents your competitor from following. And that option you've just plotted in the Genesis and custom space, how quickly you can mobilize that and leapfrog the competition. So, of course, this walkthrough represents only the merest fraction of the welter of materials that Simon's made available to support the approach. But I certainly find that opportunity to give yourselves the benefit of that situational awareness and play those what-if scenarios to be extraordinarily powerful, and to give you a much firmer footing for the initial direction setting of strategy and what will make a change to your specific organization. So, develop something that's key to your advantage that you wouldn't dream of sharing with the competition. What movements are we making? What substitutions are we making? Understand the value chain. Why is this the best option for us? What we will stop doing, what we will start doing, and where we will focus resource for the best leverage. So I can hear you all saying by now, yeah, but I thought we were talking about tech. Well, yeah, I wanted to make sure, what I see the most common as a pattern in organizations is one of the key reasons they can't keep up is they're following potentially the wrong things for the wrong reasons. But let's look at some of those trends. Once you've selected your tech options, what about the challenges of dealing with these new things as they emerge? And certainly, these challenges insert themselves as in my experience, as a noisy presence now in many solution discussions. Well, you take the mask off and we can see that actually this has just been distributed computing all along. These patterns for solving these problems have been with us for an awful long time. And we see that in a lot of the new models. And this pattern does repeat. So, deconstruct AI, does it even exist today? It's actually machine learning. A vast swathe of machine learning capability is good old-fashioned statistics. Absolutely, smattering of linear algebra and calculus, but for many software engineers, actually a welcome return to degree topics they actually already know. Potentially, the focus for software development going forward in any event. And this leads to, one of the fundamental underpinnings that still too few organizations, I think, genuinely invest in, and certainly in my experience, and that's, tech capability itself. And I do genuinely see that the ability to, partner tech with commercial insight is itself the capability. And whether we label that tech or whether we label it commercial, for me, it's not material. It's the materiality it's a capability the team needs. It's a capability the organization needs. I firmly believe it's a capability the IT leader should bring forth, because otherwise we're not going to be able to exploit the tech, however good it is. And in a technical context, in this technical forum, this may appear an odd theme. And isn't this in the realms of the bleeding obvious? Well, actually, in my experience, no. This requires an honest assessment of how much you actually are investing in hands-on tech capability. I've seen many examples where by the time we've accounted for assurance, mediation, analysis, relationship management, operations, portfolio, project, process, and change, there's actually very little left for technology. And I've seen that being less than a third or even less than a quarter of the overall budget. So how many people have you got with hands-on, and how many people have you got doing the rest of the stuff that maybe helps the rest of the organization work with this? So establishing this capability puts you on the point to see through many changes in how you can, bring these changes forth. And of course, that in itself is a dependency on being able to grow and develop those skills. And what does that look like today? If you're not investing in systematizing a learning culture, then it's likely you will be forever behind. So, you have to assume some kind of headroom to pick up the new as it becomes apparent and as it becomes material. And I would argue this is both the heart of keeping up, but also a key muscle to develop for long-term sustainability. So by investing in core skills and choosing your tech battles, you find yourself changing more dynamically with opportunities and market trends. So creating the natural conditions for learning to occur. So not everyone can staff their hold of their teams with the best of, for instance, Silicon Valley grade talent, but you can invest in developing your teams for yourself. And I would urge you all again, reflect on the best team you've worked in, the best place that you were. I'm willing to bet it was probably because of the team and what you learned while on that job. And you know, I don't think we make that association often enough. The implication of this is that there may be times when you cannot fulfill peak delivery pace throughout because you're spending so much in people development. The reality of people having the bandwidth to mentor individuals, people having the bandwidth to learn. So often this starts to drag in that clash with, well, we've made our annual budget commitment. And that for me starts to hint on, that earlier problem we mentioned about that IT cost center mentality. So many of these previous points about picking up the capability to learn and about investing in that learning start to collide headlong with the greatest barrier to picking up new tech in most, certainly corporate settings. So the cost center, your target is to reduce costs. Well, it's certainly, for me, it's time to end that annual game of cat and mouse. Research, the reason for this clumsy illustration here is, research suggests that, rats, mice, and humans are all sensitive to sunk costs after they've made the decision to pursue a reward. And we see it all the time in so many corporate tech budgets. We've gone so far along this, we've got to preserve it and keep it going, even though we know it flies in the face of any appropriate model and benchmarking of what approaches are being taken forward now. So there is profoundly a need for tech awareness, certainly in the C-suite. And, I've reflected on my experience as a CTO. I've often appropriately been tasked with what's my financial awareness, for most of the roles that and that's entirely appropriate. And you would expect that of any executive in any organization. I think what there isn't enough of is enough testing of digital capability of the executive. Is the executive aware of technology investment considerations and relevant trends? Aware of legacy versus strategic, build versus buy, control versus leverage, aware of the reality of attracting and retaining technology talent. These are now expected capabilities for an organization that has to exist in a world where the most successful organizations are those organizations leveraging technology, regardless of vertical. So, is the CFO leading the charge for digital investment to drive growth and profitability? For great data science that distills the core equation that pulls together profitability for the organization? Is this CMO leading seamless engagement with customers so embedded in their digital lives? Is your COO focused on digital operations of innovation and efficiency that propel your growth, and so on? So the IT leader has a responsibility to break out of this pattern by taking on responsibility for commercial growth, explore those competitive players we outlined earlier. So commit to the outcomes and track only your options as you go forward. Some options win, some lose, but the discipline makes you good at prioritization and good at customer validation and reduces your overall budget exposure. And we're all starting to build up assumptions and dependencies now about what we've got working within the teams themselves. And I think we do have to challenge ourselves with some honest assessments as we progress this. So can we actually deliver software today? And the basic performance aspects of delivery, many organizations are left wanting. So when you consider going forward into that change, as so many organizations are doing now, I don't think there's any organization on the planet is not under some form of digital transformation. But in the IT context, there's often a worrying knee-jerk reaction. So some organizations reflect on the perennially poor outcomes, perennially poor experiences, and then launch a scaling initiative that attempts to address both how you deliver predictable product performance and how you scale it through the organization. So your mileage may vary, but I would suggest it's more scalable to first develop the capability to develop software and then scale what you have learned in this particular context, particularly pertinent to your specific context. And then assuming we do get that pattern underway, then the journey to scaling it out is not necessarily going through, bottom-up approaches, which we see in a lot of IT context, top-down approaches, sorry, where we'll see, the executive getting particularly excited about, for instance, let's pick up this new tech. Unfortunately, that doesn't bring the engagement of the teams. But similarly, when we go bottom-up, we see the failure of being able to bring the rest of the organization with us. And we see this as an awful lot of, IT teams fall victim to, getting underway with something like an agile transformation, which can't scale beyond the IT unit because it doesn't have that executive support. So, what we look to do instead, again, drawing on the nature of the organization learning for itself, is to build that learning engine. How do we know how to learn? Have we bedded that in? We've taken the representative sample for each of the relevant parts of the organization, and we've tested and learned and brought the teams on as they got it right. So what did the first team tell us? And we bring that learning into the next team. What do these teams tell us? We bring that learning into the next team and progress that through. And for me, it's all about that organizational learning capability. And of course, now we're into the whole culture piece. It was only a matter of time before someone spotted the elephant in the room. And to make any such of those kinds of moves, now that we're on this journey, we thought we were only tinkering with technology, then we're going to have to change our culture. And of course, there are lots of management frameworks for working through that. This is just one example, but the reason I'm highlighting it here is it reflects on that reality of, unless people have experienced the change, they're unlikely to play it back. And it is something of an anti-pattern we see in too many organizations where the change is talked about, but it's not actually lived and worked through. We'll see, for this, especially the participants in this particular context, not the need to role model. What does test and learn mean? Are we role modeling curiosity? So I've seen organizations trumpet the move to a greater collaborative environment, and then in the same breath, the same uptake, start an inter-team fight on who calls that weekend's outage. So, getting into the whole blamestorming. So when you role model curiosity and interest rather than blame, you're more likely to engender the right atmosphere for sharing and learning to occur. You're demonstrating you're getting involved in business development. You're being the exemplar entrepreneur for the teams to follow. And then on this last point, how you respond to incidents and crises, haven't we all had an unbelievable learning experience of that over the last year? We can't glance over that. As we reflect on the assumed priorities from this time last year, obviously everything's changed. These have been some of the strangest days of our lives. We fear for our families and our communities. We pray for all to stay safe, and we also try and do what we can to pull our organisations through. In that pulling through, for me, there have been some profound lessons that I think inform how, when we're in a world of having to make change, how do we do that? And there's material opportunities for accelerating evolution in a way that all of those digital transformation programs never could. Many teams demonstrating the essential truths of this entirely through this period. So for instance, the power of purpose. All of those remote working practices for too long, in my experience, have been declared too difficult and too complicated. We've all done it. And it wasn't a corporate roadmap or change program that mobilized this, but a community passion to get it done, to help each other through. And this gives us a crystal clear benchmark. If your business initiative is not truly visionary and inspiring and consequential for your team's community, you'll often find yourself surrounded instead by charts and plans and governance processes that sustain the story of activity without actually any material outcome. And teams and individuals reaching across geographies and functions to establish breakthrough results in timescales that that would have been unthinkable only a few months ago, and this in contrast with the normal pattern. Business as usual managed through a swathe of projects in the core business, and usually an innovation team separately funded and managed to experiment, maybe in a new tech lab, for instance, like this kind of environment illustrated here. And under these conditions, innovations established in the lab are rarely adopted in a reasonable time frame or at any scale in the core business. And my experience has been that the very separation that creates issues when we need to integrate learnings. As we're all painfully learning in our social lives now, separation makes caring hard to do. And in that innovation lab example, the business rarely wants to stop what it's doing to consider what that funky ideas are, especially in a quarterly reporting cycle. So tomorrow never comes and we carry on as normal. And the more work the innovation lab does, the greater the distance, the greater the pain from the core business to change. So for those of you investing in development, especially, the need for innovation is even more acute. You know, if you're not innovating, why even be in the business of investing in that development in the first place? And maybe the biggest consequence of the sudden forced remote working, the outbreak of trust outside direct monitoring of the office, people getting work done. So what are the outcomes we achieve when we enable that trust? Which leads us to the empowered team model. And again, I must stress, I'm not being explicit here about all teams should be multidisciplinary. What this is illustrating is what happens when you enable a group to work together. So there's a particular example I was aware of in a community discussion where one organization was highlighting the amazing response of its COVID team assembled as a special project. And genuinely in the same conversation, they were bemoaning how they couldn't get the same performance out of other teams. And it's staggering that that reflection wasn't there, that maybe the reason why this team was successful is because they were being allowed to collaborate in real time and work together. So when we mobilize teams, when we empower them, we'll find we get different outcomes. And these examples give us living, breathing proof. If we create the environment for the outcomes we want, then you'll see the culture change before your eyes. So it's enabling the teams is one of the core aspects for me of creating that right environment. And that brings us back to the core scenario we began this whole discussion with. So everything been discussing with reference to keeping up and staying ahead comes back to the need for adaptability at core. And this helps us to put together that Red Queen hypothesis. So again, just to repeat, it's that notion that to survive an evolving system, you must co-evolve with the best traits to survive that system. There's a constant arms race between co-evolving species. There's a constant arms race between organizations. So taken from Lewis Carroll's Looking Glass, I think he took the analogy, the Red Queen tells Alice as they run against each other, if you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. So this is a useful analogy. It also gives us one of our fundamental underpinnings for being able to keep up with technology changes, new frameworks, tools, and methods. The core responsibility of the IT leader is to create the environment in which such evolution can occur. So our summary is about the leader's responsibility to create the conditions for adaptability to flourish. So think of the situational awareness. What are we giving ourselves as options, and are those options transparent to all? What are we doing about that change, and what's our plan for that change? Are we investing in technology skills, whatever else we are doing, and are we creating the empowered environment? And if we do that, then we maybe get that benefit, future fit. And we're in the habit of handing out these key guidelines. Here are a few more I'll leave you with. You'll have picked up by now, I just can't resist these kinds of things. So, but make a new service, do one thing well, build afresh rather than complicate existing, expect the output of every service to get the input as one other yet unknown service, design and build to be tried early, ideally within weeks, use tools to lighten the task, even if you have to detour to build the tools. I'm sure many of you will have spotted, well, okay, he's chiming on here about the usual contemporary suspects of cloud native and agile, shift left, DevOps. I don't know if there's any of you on the call maybe will have spotted that these actual prescriptions are only slightly modified, a comma or two, from the Unix Systems Journal in 1978. These were actually time-honored principles that, to our shame, we've somehow let slip. So I would contend it's time to reclaim those capabilities and that stance, and to get in the front foot with technology. Thank you very much for that. I'll leave you with these references if you'd like to dive deeper. These are all the people I absolutely copied for the material in this presentation that inform the observations I've made in a number of organizations. I've already touched on Simon Wardley, but if you haven't had a chance, I would urge you to catch up with the blog from Andy Walker, where I've got tongue-tied through here. You'll see some great articles on there that that really walk through some resonant examples for all of that. So we'll leave it there, and thank you all very much indeed for listening.
Whoa, thank you very much, Finbarr. That was great. Now, I think we have some questions. Who is going to handle the questions? David, are you there, or should I do it? I'll tell you what, I'll do it. Okay, there's a question here, which says, Ashok says, very interesting presentation. Is there any survey on how many organizations are successfully adapting to new technology and training, investing, innovation, and collaboration?
I will confess I'm not directly aware of a specific survey on that. I think what's interesting to note is, you know, I'm sure you're working in an organization that's feeling the need to do something about this. It will be feeling that need based on competitive pressure that it's already seeing. So, you know, the fact that those things are proving to be successful for a number of organizations is interesting. What's also interesting to note, what I do know, is that depending on whose, you know, analysis you subscribe to, something like 70 to 90% of transformation efforts actually fail. And I think in that, the heart of that is whether, you know, organizations are giving themselves that evolutionary capability to see it through.
Okay, thank you very much, Finbarr. Well, I was very impressed by a number of the statements you put out and so on, not least the ones which compared what we're doing now with the 1978 Unix manual, I think it was.
That's it.
Like in relation to cloud native and microservices, agile
Absolutely.
and shift left, and DevOps. Well, that's kind of impressive, but also kind of depressive. Now, in the audience, we must have some younger people who think that we are really pushing things forward and would refute this claim that we're going back to the past. Does anyone have a view on that in the audience? Okay, well, let me put another point of view here. As far as what is a leader, I was impressed by what you said about a leader is to do with what your focus is,
sure,
what you're measuring, how you allocate resources, how you allocate rewards and status. I think it's very important. How you recruit, promote, and select. And finally, on that side, how you react to incidents and crises.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, please go ahead.
Yeah, so it's the role modeling of it. So I can't tell you the number of times that I meet organizations who will express, you know, we've talked about this new stuff a number of times. We want our teams to be more entrepreneurial. We want them to use these test and learn approaches. But unfortunately, the leaders are not necessarily role modeling the reality of that. Yeah, so you know, for instance, it's a new thing. We're gonna try this new initiative. So the team comes up with an idea, brings it forth. Maybe we've used the Wardley mapping to find a new opportunity. Yeah, in bringing forth a new idea, it's necessarily different from what we do today. And I see it too often that unfortunately that new thing gets shot down because it's not recognizable. They don't want to invest in it. So the same leadership that's saying we need to do the new stuff is not actually letting the new stuff go ahead because it doesn't recognize it. And by the time the team's worked on the feedback, they end up with something that's, you know, in some contexts, maybe has stuck a web front end to what they're already doing, yeah, rather than reimagined how we deliver this to what we deliver to our customer in a completely different context. So I think, you know, that role modeling is key. And especially in the collaboration and, you know, building trust in team environments. The leader has to role model those scenarios. You know, that if there is a significant failure, we're role modeling our curiosity in getting to the bottom of that failure. Not, I've seen, you know, in some instances, people being specifically blamed, for instance, which only causes people to cover up incidents rather than share learnings.
Well, sharing learnings is certainly important. And I think we've had a period of accelerated learning enforced accelerated learning during the past year. So
Hugely.
so I'm going to pick up on another point you made, Finbarr, which is that innovation should be BAU. Well, that's right. But I mean, do you think we need some real knee-jerk incident to make our knees jerk and us to learn as much as we have in the last year? Is this something that we necessarily need in business to be taken up? Or can we evolve and learn and so on in a structured and orderly fashion?
I think that, you know, it's given an ability to get some momentum in the team. There's no reason why that can't be structurally managed, and I think it is in affording, you know, the you know, those first waves of teams the empowerment to do that. Once you've got the model underway, it's then somewhat easier to scale it. And I notice, you know, the next great question is a good example of that. You know, how do we kill failing initiatives? Isn't there a risk? That sounds negative. Well, you know, that's a great signal to the need for better role modeling from the executive. So you'll notice I highlighted the notion of options. Yeah. So we're running with options, just like an investment thesis, if you like. So rather than, you know, saying, rather than pointing out this project as a failure or this team is a failure, we instead orientate the team towards delivering an outcome. Now, to deliver that outcome, it happens to be running today with this option. But how long are we going to give this option to succeed? Maybe we'll give it 2 to 6 weeks. Maybe we'll give it a whole business quarter. But when we get to the end of that period, we'll evaluate, is this option succeeding? No, it isn't. What's our next option? And encourage the team to be evaluating options, yeah, which is a key to getting a test and learn capability underway. But, you know, the executive needs to be confident in that, confident in the team. I trust the team to reach the outcome that we've given them. The option that they're running with right now may or may not be successful, but I trust this team to deliver us the option that would. So it's not a negative thing. It's you're appropriately stopping something that isn't working. So getting out of the blame storming route, getting out of that's a failing project, change the terminology, use different terminology, but yeah, absolutely, you know, orientate towards a different notion of what we're doing. We're working towards an outcome. We're not delivering a project, and we see that too often. We've said we're going to deliver this project, we're going to deliver this project, and nobody dare call it a failure. Deliver, you know, think of options and think how quickly we can test those options. You know, what means we can test an option quickly, and if, you know, in the event it's not successful, what's the next option off the rank, if you like, that can help us meet that same outcome.
Great point, great point. And I don't know if you can see the question that Wally is asking there. Would you like to, well, let me read it and you answer. Yeah, I wonder if Finbarr would share his thoughts on how IT leaders are able to balance the tension between their organization's risk appetite for adopting new tech and their personal quest for driving innovation and learning about emerging tech. This is a very real question, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, you know, I would encourage, you know, maybe exploration of the commercial opportunities as the leverage for that conversation. So, you know, by opening out the commercial opportunities of exploring some of these options. So again, think of Wardley, open up a commercial opportunity, which means to achieve that, we need to explore some of this new tech. But the reason we're doing it is to realize this great commercial opportunity. So we're bringing the participants into the evaluation. And it's another reason why I highlight that model. It brings all parties into the decision process. This is not something the IT leader is deciding to do and taking the entire risk on. It's bringing everybody into that decision making. What the IT leader can do is encourage that joint accountability, encourage that evaluation by the transparency of that kind of model. Yeah. So we're all taking this move. We want to explore that option. We want that new commercial initiative. We're all now, with eyes wide open, going to embrace this new tech. And starting to think of those kinds of ways of orientating those conversations. So I guess the implication is taking on some responsibility for commercial exploitation that maybe is not so habitual for those of us in IT teams, but arguably should be in a world where we're suggesting, you know, the so-called business team needs to get more tech oriented. The next one's a great one. Yeah, these are all really good. I'm determined to get through them in the time. So
you will. That's fine.
how to influence the CFO from thinking of IT as a cost center. So it's kind of the same conversation. So, you know, there are very few sectors, really very few sectors that are not directly challenged by digital equivalents. So, you know, it's usually there is an opportunity to open out a discussion about how are we dealing with this kind of competitor, and you know, by becoming more confident of what tech-driven business opportunities can look like, then, you know, we open out a different conversation. So rather than, you know, we'd rather you didn't think of us as a cost center, maybe by leading with commercial opportunity discussions, then you reorientate the framing, if you like, of what the CFO might typically be thinking. You know, the CFO might have had a habit of working with IT guys, and the IT guys have always looked at it, well, we can do this cheaper or that cheaper. Maybe they're not habitually in the conversation of, here's a great business opportunity for us. And that helps to reorientate the framing. So again, it's taking on responsibility for some of the commercial discussion, but using the examples, which usually are abundant. I'm happy to be put wrong, especially on the call, but it's very rare that there isn't, you know, some context where there's a digital participant in play that you can point to, and therefore have a transparent conversation about, well, what are we doing about this? And you do realize that's all about tech. And in our world, Mr. CFO, tech is our team. We need to have a response for this. So, you know, therefore you're starting to get into the whole development rather than cost center discussion.
Great, great. And then there's this question about resources, about people. I understand every organization is working to improve by optimizing manual and automated processes. How, as a digital leader, can we introduce an organization that's more future ready, especially in the context of IT services companies with large bases of IT consultants?
We introduce it to the future, especially in the context of IT service companies with a large base of strong IT consultants. Well, you know, I hesitate to think who that might be. But, you know, I guess, again, you know, I would imagine, so, you know, if you agree with me on the framing of where is technology coming from now, the source for technology is no longer those traditional vendors. So anybody who's in the business of delivering technology expertise, IT consultancy, for instance, absolutely has to be on the front foot of where is that world heading. And I would suggest be directly involved, be part of those communities. So, you know, there's a need to get it in amongst that world. But, you know, that's what we're right in the middle of now. The direction for technology we use in enterprise IT is being set by the consumer internet. It's not being set by the vendor community. And that was the kind of contrast I was pointing out. You know, I can remember in my career, there was a time when you specifically went to the vendors to find out what to do. And, you know, the challenge we're all facing is that none of these technologies are coming from the vendors. They're all coming from the consumer internet. So follow the stream, you know, follow the source of that stream. And an organization that's IT consultancy based, consider how you can get in amongst the stream, how you can swim in that stream, you know, and get involved. I hope I'm making sense. I'm trying to second guess what loose context might be, but yeah.
Yeah. Amit, if you'd like to ask a follow-up to your question, feel free. Likewise, we've got a few minutes left. If you have a last-minute question or a burning issue, please do put it forward. Finbarr, I'd just like to say you've made a nice balance. I mean, I liked the orderly mapping and so on, but you made a nice reference to the increasing innovation that's been taking place, and also the increasing importance of individuals working together and so on, rather than the hierarchical structures that we're used to and the office environments we're used to. Do you think this is going to continue? Or do you think the big corporates and so on are going to grab back their office-based people and make us work in hierarchical ways again?
So, my guess would be that while there will inevitably be some who will look to snap back, and I think there was a headline in the press this week from a leader of one major organization, suggesting that. again, you know, part of my intent here was to point to, you know, illustrate the contextual awareness of how things have changed, and the contextual awareness that it's the consumer internet that's driving this direction entirely. All of those organizations have pretty much, you know, declared en masse that going forward, they're assuming people are not coming back to the office. At best, it'll be a 50-50 split. You might do half of your time in the office, half of your time at home. I genuinely believe you can't put this genie back in the bottle. So I think there'll be some organizations will attempt to recreate 2019. Yeah, they'll make a go at that. I think they'll quickly learn that they're competing with organizations who've now learned how to be distributed, and think about the benefits of that. So, you know, genuinely, your team members can be anywhere. So in a world where, especially in IT, we're worried about how we get hold of the right skills, all of a sudden it actually is very straightforward to have skills anywhere on the planet. We used to worry about that a great deal. Now our boundaries have massively expanded. So that's going to be a strength to so many organizations. So I think we'll see some retrenchment. You know, some organizations will try and recreate 2019. As I said, I think over time the pattern will set in for mixed working. I genuinely don't see how you're going to put this genie back in the bottle, and especially for technology practitioners, it's just such, you know, the benefits of that blended model are so strong. It'll win out. I might be entirely wrong. Probably likely am.
What a covering statement at the end.
Yeah.
Somebody is asking, are the video or slides going to be available on the website? The answer is yes. We have recorded this session, and providing the recording is okay, and that means we check it for quality, and we check it with Finbarr in terms of the things he intended to say and show and so on. Providing those are all okay, then the video will be available, and fairly soon. Let me be conservative and say within a week's time, and that will be well worth watching, I know. But it just remains for me to thank Finbarr for a great session, a great presentation. Finbarr, thank you very much. I know we're going to be seeing more of you, and so, you know, we will look forward to hearing more from you as well.